Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mathilde, and I'm the Digital Marketing Analyst here at Amity. So I'd really like to thank everyone who is taking the time to join us live for today's webinar. Super excited about Joel's presentation. So just to give everyone a little bit of context and a little bit of a background, Amity is a customer success management software, and it's a tool that CSMs can use to retain and grow their customers at scale with a variety of things, including health scoring, tracking engagements, automated emails, and things like that. So you can actually request a demo if you're interested after the webinar. But I hope this gives you a little bit of context around why we organize these webinars about customer success topics every 2 weeks. But that's actually all that you're going to be hearing about Amity today, because we are thrilled to have an awesome presenter with an incredible wealth of knowledge joining us today. Carron is the Customer Success Analyst at Mode, where he works with sales, marketing, and product teams to create open source reporting resources for Mode customers. And before joining Mode, Joel was actually the data and analytics lead of global community operations at Uber. So we're super excited to have him with us today and really looking forward for all of you to hear what he's prepared about this topic for us today. So Joel is joining us to present a data visualization framework that he's created to be able to measure and analyze CSM performance. And it reconciles different KPIs. Specifically, today we'll be talking about retention rate, expansion MRR, and NPS. So I hope everyone is super excited about learning about this today. I definitely am. And before we do get started with the presentation and introduce Joel, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes that I need to share with everyone. So join the conversation on Twitter. We will be sharing screenshots and retweeting people. So don't hesitate to tag us at GetAmity and at Mode Analytics. You can also use the hashtag CSWebinar and take screenshots of slides when you see them, share them. Feel free to join the conversation. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So in about 20 minutes, we'll be opening up the Q&A. If you look at your Zoom webinar panel, you have like a Q&A button that you can click, which will let you send us questions. Don't wait until the end, just send them as the presentation goes. When they arise, we'll make sure to try to answer as many as possible at the end of the webinar today. And as always, we are recording today's webinar, so check your inbox before the end of the week. We'll be sending you the deck and the recording of the webinar as well, which you can share with your team or anyone else you know in customer success who would find today's webinar interesting. And that's it for me. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. And Joel, thanks so much for joining us and taking the time to let us know about this framework today. Super excited. And I'm going to hand things over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the very warm intro, and thanks, Amity, for inviting me to lead this webinar today. And then also thanks to everyone who's attending. Definitely excited about this topic, and looking forward to sharing this with you, and then answering your questions in the Q&A that follows. So as we mentioned, today's talk is going to be about a visualization framework for understanding CSM performance and analyzing across different KPIs. But before we do that, I think it's important that we define customer success goals to begin with. So let's get started. These are some customer success goals that I've found to be somewhat universal, which is why I chose them for today's webinar, in hopes that they'll apply to different types of businesses, but certainly every business is unique. And these goals may or may not apply to you in a direct way, and you might want to swap them out for something else. That's totally fine. Hopefully this visualization framework will still apply for however ways you want to tweak those goals. So let's talk a little bit about these. So retention rate, obviously, like this is really important. And I think that there's mainly two sort of subcategories of retention rate. When we're talking about retention rate, we might be talking about customer retention. So basically like the number of accounts that we're retaining. And we may also be talking about revenue retention because in many businesses, all customers might not be created equal when it comes to the revenue side of things. So there might be additional value to retaining the largest customers or the most valuable and lucrative from a revenue standpoint. Cool. Next, we would want to think about expansion revenue. So in addition to merely retaining folks, a CSM can also help drive this expansion, either through upsells or cross-selling. Again, the sort of specific dynamics of that will depend a little bit upon everyone's business, but this sort of general idea seems to hold true across most businesses. And finally, the last category that we'll be talking about today is Net Promoter Score. I think most people will probably be familiar with this. Some folks may use something like CSAT, like a customer satisfaction score. Certainly, for the purpose of this exercise, those types of metrics could very much be interchangeable if you're using something different. But for the purpose of today's webinar, we'll be assuming that this is using a Net Promoter Score. Cool. So, and this may be review for a lot of folks, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page before we get into the charting, like exactly how these sort of metrics are being calculated and what they mean from a business standpoint. Because I find a lot of times as an analyst, that's really useful to make sure that everyone's on the same page before we start kind of throwing out numbers and metrics and that sort of thing, that we really have a firm grasp of where they live within the context of like the actual business. Cool. So with that, I'd like to talk first about the first subcategory of retention rate that I mentioned, which is the customer retention rate. So as you can see here, we'll define that as the percentage of non-new customers you have at the end of a given period relative to the number you had at the start. Often we'll look at this in monthly increments, and the way that today's sort of example is set up is very much on a monthly framework. So in that case, the customer retention percentage would be equal to the number of non-new customers you have at the end of a given month relative to the number of customers you had at the end of the previous month. So pretty straightforward. All right, and next we have the revenue retention rate. Very, very similar to the customer retention rate, but in this case, we're looking at the percentage of non-new revenue you have at the end of a given period relative to the amount you had at the start. And you can see the MRR retention percentage there is the non-new revenue at the end of the given month over the revenue you had at the end of the previous month. And then there's a note here that customer churn and downselling can both be causes of revenue churn, which is a little bit different than the customer retention rate, where only customer churn can change that. Cool. Then let's define expansion revenue rate. So this would be the percentage of upsell revenue you had at the end of a given period relative to the total revenue you had at the start. So again, this formula is there. The expansion MRR percentage would be the new revenue from upsells in a given month over the revenue you had at the end of the previous month. Great. And then finally here, we'll talk about Net Promoter Score. I'm sure many people are familiar with this. Basically, the way this works is that you'll ask your customers a question along the lines of how likely are you to recommend, our product, our service to a friend or colleague. And then the customer is able to pick their response on a 0 to 10 scale. 9s and 10s are considered promoters. 0s through 6s are considered detractors, and 7s and 8s are considered neutral. And then to calculate the Net Promoter Score, we take the percentage of promoters and subtract the percentage of detractors. Cool. So hopefully that's familiar and review to everyone. Sorry for if it's a little too much in review, but again, I think it's important that we're sort of all on the same page before we step into the next part of this, which is hopefully the more exciting and interesting. So again, here are our 3 customer success goals. So now let's talk a little bit about visualizing these goals and understanding customer success performance. Cool. So I'd like to talk first about some traditional approaches to visualizing this type of data. And toward the end of this, we'll also kind of compare and contrast these traditional approaches with the new visualization framework that I'd like to introduce today. And I'd very much love to get your thoughts on that and hear your questions in the Q&A. First of all, I'd like to show, bar charts here. Pretty familiar, one of the most basic chart types, but certainly useful. So in this case, we've got 4 CSMs. You can see Elaine, George, Jerry, and Kramer. If you're a Seinfeld fan, hopefully you got that. And we've got these 3 categories that we mentioned, which is the expansion MRR, the NPS, and the retention rate. And in this case, the bar charts are really useful for helping us rank in each individual category. We can get a sense of who's leading and who's behind and sort of where each CSM stands relative to one another. Cool. But perhaps we might want to do something a little bit more sophisticated than that. In this case, we're looking at 3 box plots here. Now, box plots are useful for helping to illustrate the distribution. So in the previous case, we were looking at sort of one number of, Jerry's NPS, but he may have NPS that fluctuates over time. And he may have a very consistent NPS, or he may have a pretty volatile NPS. So in this case, what we're doing here is we're actually taking each monthly metric for across all of these categories for each CSM, and then we're using a box plot to illustrate that distribution. So if you're familiar with box plots, this might be familiar to you. But we can actually learn a little bit more about where each CSM stands when we're looking at it this way. So if we look at, for instance, the chart on the far left for retention rate, we can see, first of all, that Elaine seems to be doing the best, and that George seems to be doing the worst. But we can also learn that Kramer, who is on the far right, is the most volatile because his box plot is spread over the widest area. Whereas George is pretty consistent, but just consistently bad in this area. And so we can kind of get a sense of how that type of dynamic will play out. Again, this is sort of a traditional approach to looking at this type of data, but definitely very useful. And then finally, I wanted to mention time series. Again, we mentioned that a lot of these metrics, in fact, will not be static over time, and they will change, and new dynamics will happen in the business, and agents, CSMs may improve or decline in terms of their performance. And these time series line charts can give us an idea of how that performance is trending over time. And then we also do get a sense of where each CSM is in performance to each other. And again, this is spread out. We have separate plots here for each of these 3 categories. Cool. So what I have just showed you, I would consider pretty traditional charting. And traditional charting options are effective. They're really good for analyzing performance toward each metric. But I'd say one of the challenges here is it can be difficult to understand the relationships across all 3 of those goals at once. So the framework I'm about to introduce is meant to address that issue of trying to understand the dynamic of how all 3 of these metrics relate to one another. So what I've done here is I've taken all 3 metrics and I've plotted them on a cube. So you can see on this z-axis here, we have the NPS score, which is going, it looks like the upper bound here is up to 80. And then we have the expansion MRR, and we have the retention as well. So this is a little bit hard to see in terms of 2 dimensions. So I'm going to go ahead and explore this and interact with this chart. And you can see I can actually drag this around. And each one of these data points obviously relates to one CSM. So we can see Elaine here at the top. We remember she's a top performer. And now we can see she's actually top performing across 3 categories. We can see that Jerry's basically in 2nd place here. Where he falls in the cube is sort of second to Elaine. Kramer is essentially in 3rd. And then we can see in the sort of back corner of this cube, is where George, our underperformer, falls. And we can see what his metrics are across all three of these categories at once. Cool. But again, we sort of mentioned that just sort of like taking one data point might not tell the whole story. So if we maybe want to see how things change over time, in mode, we can actually go in here and switch this parameter from year to month and give this another run and allow this cell to run. Cool. And now we'll actually have data points for each of these months. This can be a lot to look at all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle off everyone except Elaine. Great. Now I can actually see that Elaine had a pretty rough August and a really strong November. And I get a sense that even though, yeah, that August may not have been so great, again, all of her data points across these three metric categories are very strong. George, on the other hand, we remember from the box plot, was a pretty consistent performer, but consistently underperforming. And we can see that's kind of true here as well. All of his data points sort of fall in this back corner of the cube where we wouldn't want to be. Jerry, again, kind of close to Elaine, but not quite at that same level. And then finally, Kramer, we remember he was pretty volatile. And we can see that here as well, as his data points are sort of scattered around all sides of this cube. Cool. Yeah, so I want to mention just how this kind of came to be. This cube is a visualization that I actually built in Mode's Python notebook using a library called Plotly. And if you're not an analyst, if you're not someone that uses Python, but you're interested in maybe taking a crack at this type of thing, we've actually built this, this report on an open source environment. And if you'd like to, you can actually, we'll be sharing, I understand that on the landing page where the recording of this webinar will live, where you'll get a link to in the email that follows, that we'll be hosting a link to this report as well, which you'll be able to check out the code for it, and you can actually clone it as well. And whether or not you have a Mode account already, you'll be able to interact with it. And if you do want to start playing around with it in Mode, you can actually clone that and then apply your own data to this framework without having to do much to update the Python code that powers it. Cool. So yeah, that may have been like kind of, yeah, cool to look at, but people might be wondering like, all right, but kind of how do I apply this in my day-to-day? You know, it might be like a fun toy, but like, what can we actually get out of it that's valuable from a business standpoint? So yeah, I wanted to go over some thoughts that I had as far as like how you might apply these insights. So for one, I think that this visualization allows us to rapidly classify CSM performance across three goals. With the sort of traditional charting that we looked at, we kind of had to go back and forth between different metrics, and someone may have been doing really well in one and poorly in another, and we kind of have to juggle each of those performance assessments simultaneously. It also helps us better understand consistency and volatility. We got a sense from the box plots of who was consistent and who was not, and same for the time series as well. But each of those sort of only spoke to one metric at a time. Whereas with this 3D visualization, we actually can understand sort of the holistic consistency and volatility of each agent. And then as far as like how I might think about applying this on my team, it makes it pretty easy for us to quickly identify CSMs that have complementary skills, and we can potentially arrange some type of knowledge share, so we can see that someone is struggling in certain areas but pretty strong in others, and pair them with someone who has complementary skills and areas of improvement. Cool. And then I mentioned at the top of this section that I think it's important to understand the role and the place of using 3D visualizations as they relate to traditional charting. It is certainly not my intention to send the message that we should replace traditional charting with all these cubes and stuff like that. I think very much they provide a nice complement, but should not replace traditional charting. So traditional charting, I think, has a lot of strengths. For one, it's very familiar. So as we're looking at these box plots, or even more so the bar charts and line charts, we just sort of intuitively know how to read them. And when we share them with other folks on teams or our executive team, it's pretty clear what they mean and who's doing well and what's doing not well. So there's not a lot of like additional work someone has to be doing to get to those insights. 3D visualizations are certainly novel in that sense. Probably when I first pulled that up on the screen, it was a little bit like, what? Like, and hopefully it wasn't like that the entire time, but I mean, it may take some getting used to. Traditional charting is very targeted, or it's useful in that way. And what I mean by that is if we really want to dig in on one specific metric, that's a good use for traditional charting. If we're super interested in NPS specifically and we want to see that over time and we want to see that distribution monthly, traditional charting is probably going to be more effective there. Whereas 3D visualization succeeds in providing that holistic framework where we can kind of simultaneously consider the effects of each of these. Traditional charting, I put static here. It doesn't have to be static, but it certainly works well static. You can look at a printed, line chart and it's still meaningful. Whereas with the 3D visualizations, there's sort of an interaction that's required. It's almost required just to understand sort of the depth. You kind of have to be able to drag around and move and see where each of those data points is for it to kind of click. And then traditional charting is informative. Whereas I'd say 3D visualization is more explorative. Like you might find things in a 3D visualization that you didn't even know you were looking for. Whereas traditional charting is pretty good for answering specific questions that we already have in mind, like which agent, which CSM is doing really well this month in this particular category. Cool. Well, that is it as far as the presentation is concerned. Again, my name is Joel. You can reach me at joel@modeanalytics.com if you have praise. If you have concerns, don't send it to that email. I'm just kidding. Feel free to. And I guess now we'll move on to the Q&A section.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joel. That was awesome. We already have a few questions lined up, but I really encourage everyone to send us their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So why don't we get started with one question here. Do you recommend introducing a variable compensation plan based on this model?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably not off the bat. As I mentioned, one of the strengths, I would say, of traditional charting is that it's very concrete and very accepted in terms of how to interpret it. Whereas sort of the 3D visualization approach it has this interaction level, and it's a little bit more ambiguous and open to interpretation. So from that perspective, I certainly think that it makes sense to potentially have some type of variable compensation if that's the way that your business is set up, that reflects the goals of your team. And certainly to that end, I think that it's important to have not just one goal that you're working toward, but several, because I think it's important to kind of make sure that we're approaching these goals in a balanced way. And so from that perspective, I think it's probably fair. But I don't know if I was sort of managing a team of CSMs that a 3D visualization would be like the go-to chart I would have to like determine that variable compensation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. Another question here from Kristen is referring to your first visualizations with 4 CSMs on the cube. Do you have any advice on how you would use that for, let's say, 20 plus or 50 plus CSMs, and how that visualization might be affected and leveraged with a larger team?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So I think there's actually a lot of exciting things that you can do when you have larger teams that way. Typically, if there is a team of, let's say, 50, a lot of times what I found is that they'll actually be broken up into some sort of subcategories, like they're probably not all reporting to the same person, let's say. So we can actually even then analyze sort of their manager's performance by grouping each of the sort of reporting CSMs up to their manager, and then plotting that manager in the cube as well. Similarly, some teams are going to be separated by region, and so we could actually roll those CSMs up to their regional level, and then compare each region against each other. Yeah, I agree with you. If there's like a concern about, like, if you got like 50 of these data points, or if you look at it monthly and you've got just hundreds of data points to look through, that could certainly be a lot. So I guess I would recommend a couple things. Like, one would be there's probably an additional hierarchy that might be interesting to look at to understand, like I mentioned, the CSM manager performance or the regional performance, and then potentially like break the CSMs that you're looking at in the cube into some subcategory. So potentially, like, all the folks from one region, compare them, compare top performers, compare people based on when they joined. So like the cohort in which they started, like veterans that started, 2 or 3 years ago versus people that started this year. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do there as you start to like pool those groups of folks into different ways. Great question.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. That's really interesting. We definitely get a lot of questions around how to measure your success as a team lead. So that I really like that part about being able to, like, reflect the performance of a team on, who is managing them and things like that. Awesome. So it's 28. Let's take one more question very quickly before wrapping up. We have a question from Ross here. Wondering what the typical level of effort it takes to build a custom visualization like the one that you showed in Mode.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would say it's not that much effort. There's certainly it depends a little bit on your how comfortable you are with something like Python to begin with. I will say that before joining the Mode team a couple years ago, I had used Python occasionally, but one of the issues I faced was it was very separate from the rest of my analytics workflow, so I didn't actually use it that often, and therefore I didn't spend a lot of time on it. One of the nice things about Mode is it's completely integrated into the product. And what I found is a lot of these libraries are pretty intuitive once you start to get going. So I mentioned that this particular visualization was built in Plotly, and Plotly has a lot of great examples on their website that you can reference. And each sort of aspect of the visualization is set up in a pretty modular way. So it's pretty clear to see how you can make certain changes to update it to look how you want, and change axes, dimensions, and that sort of thing. I found it to be pretty intuitive and straightforward. And once you sort of kind of get going, it's not that difficult at all. And I also mentioned as well, if you're completely new to Python, or if the idea of Python is intimidating, but you are interested in kind of doing this type of analysis, we will be sharing this report specifically, and it'll be set up in such a way that it would be relatively straightforward to plug and play. So as far as the question about just building custom visualizations in general, I think Mode's the best platform to do that type of thing because of the integrated Python notebook. We also have a open HTML editor within the reporting interface. So if you prefer to do things in JavaScript, you can certainly do that. And then if you're interested in doing this particular type of report, that'll be like as easy as it gets, because it'll just be a matter of cloning this report and plugging your data into it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the answer and for all of that information. Wrap up, but beforehand, I just really want to thank everyone for joining us, and I really want to thank you for presenting. I think you had your contact info on a slide beforehand. I'm sure I would definitely recommend everyone check out Mode, maybe connect with you on LinkedIn. Amity is actually a Mode customer ourselves, and we use it for our marketing stats, so I would definitely recommend it and recommend everyone check it out. So thanks again for being here. Joel, thanks for all of your knowledge and sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Awesome. Yeah, it was super fun. Everyone, we have one more webinar before the winter break, so check out your inbox and you'll get an invite soon. But that's it for today. So thank you so much, and thanks again, Joel.
Thank you.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.